What I've always liked about philosophy is its focus on the big questions and its unremitting effort to synthesize what we know about ourselves and the world. At its best, it can provide a coherent way of looking at things so that we can muddle through life more sensibly than we might otherwise. So, this is a philosophical guide rather than a self-help book. It doesn't contain a 10-step program to happiness, wealth, or weight loss. Instead, it offers a way of thinking about what matters in life that helps us deal with the challenges of conflicting goals, lack of information, and an often uncooperative world. As I write these words, I'm very conscious of the fact that the main obstacles to living well for most of the world's population come from external sources, not from inner conflict. Injustice, poverty, oppression, inadequate health care, unfair labor practices, and so on are enormous obstacles to living well. They raise complex political and economic questions that are not my expertise. I do think that those of us fortunate enough not to be impeded by such daunting external obstacles ought to think about our role in solving problems like these. And while this book isn't going to save the world, it does offer tools for thoughtful people to get their priorities straight. Since philosophical thinking tends to be very abstract, I've tried to use a lot of examples to illustrate the theoretical points I make. Often I use myself as an example, and I have to admit that talking about personal examples in this way feels strange to me, since it's not what philosophers usually do. Instead, we tend to talk about generic characters A and B, who do generic actions X and Y at time 1 or 2. Sometimes we get more realistic and make up characters who have names, like Anna and Bob. But it's not usual in the tradition in which I was raised to talk about one's own life in any detail. I don't think that thinly described examples of hypothetical people are good enough for this subject matter. The kind of process that is involved in understanding our goals and values depends heavily on the details of a person's life. So to illustrate the process in this book, I had to talk about experiences I know well enough to be familiar with those details. Fortunately, I'm fairly sure my experiences are not unique, and I'm hopeful that they will resonate with those listening to this audiobook. I've also tried to add less detailed examples based on friends and people I've read about wherever I can. One thing I talk about in some depth is being a woman in a field that hasn't been particularly welcoming to women. The experience of being marginalized is really not something that is discussed in the literature on happiness and well-being. Philosophers who write about well-being and happiness have tended to talk about generic individuals rather than women or men, Black people or Asian people, and so on. This seems to me problematic, at least when we try to apply our philosophy to the real world, because how we cope with our social world is tremendously important to how well we can flourish. It's useful to talk about the context of prejudice and oppressive socialization, because we're better able to cope with something once we recognize how it affects us. It is also tricky to talk about this context, because there are so many different experiences, and I can only speak knowledgeably about my own. As I write this, 1 year after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in my city, Minneapolis, I am particularly conscious of the ways in which Black Americans' experience is different from mine. I chose to focus mainly on my own experience so that I could stick with what I know to be true. But after reading the memoirs and calls to arms from many brilliant Black writers, James Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ibram X. Kendi, Isabel Wilkerson, I do think that there are some broad commonalities in the experiences of people who are coping with a world that doesn't want to let them do what they want to do. This doesn't mean that we know what it's like to be in each other's shoes. Our experiences are often too different for that. But it might mean that we can benefit from the same kinds of strategies for coping with other people's prejudiced expectations.